Good afternoon. My name is Price Drake, and today I will be discussing white-collar crime and prevention. The points of interest that I have chosen to highlight are white-collar crime, defined, history of white-collar crime, different types of crimes, notable cases in the United States, effects of these crimes on investors, ethics in the business world, as well as government regulation and legislation. What is white-collar crime? The FBI describes white-collar crime as follows. Reportedly coined in 1939, the term white-collar crime is now synonymous with a full range of frauds committed by business and government professionals. These crimes are characterized by deceit, concealment, or violation of trust, and are not dependent on the application or threat of physical force or violence. The motivation behind these crimes is financial, to obtain or avoid losing money, property, or services, or to secure a personal or business advantage. Often there is a misconception that white-collar crime is a victimless crime, yet time and time again this is disproven. History of white-collar crime. While white-collar crime has been around since the beginning of civilization, whether that be bribery, price-fixing, or monopolies, the rise of white-collar crimes has come about since the Industrial Revolution in the United States and much of the West. Corporations gained great power and the ability to make consumers pay outrageous prices, thus creating public outrage. Also, due to lack of information, securities fraud was easily committed by simply saying your company was building vast railroads in other countries, making it easy to hide investment funds and losses. Now, with today, things like this wouldn't be as easy due to the media, the internet, cell phones, but back in those days, it was not that easy to gain information. You either had to be on the ground or hear it secondhand from somebody that you trusted, and as we have seen, that can get you into trouble. I've chosen to highlight three different crimes, one of which being embezzlement. Embezzlement is described as fraudulent taking of personal property by someone to whom it was entrusted, most often associated with the misappropriation of money. Embezzlement can occur regardless of whether the defendant keeps the personal property or transfers it to a third party. Embezzlement can be perpetrated by anyone with access to a company or organization's financials. Small, unnoticeable amounts over long periods of time, or a large one-time sum with the intent to disappear is typically how embezzlement is perpetrated. Next, we look at securities fraud. Securities fraud is also known as stock fraud and investment fraud. It is a deceptive practice in the stock or commodities market that induces investors to make purchases or sale decisions on the basis of false information, frequently resulting in losses in violation of security laws. Executives at publicly traded firms are often inclined to commit securities fraud because much of their personal holdings may be in the form of stock in their companies. This may include, but is not limited to, hiding debts and inflating earnings to cause a higher valuation of the company. These executives also may begin to sell off large amounts of stock in the days leading up to a collapse of their company. If they know their fraudulent activities are about to be discovered and their company is going to go under, many of them sell off everything they own in that company. Next is a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme is an investment fraud that involves the payment of purported returns to existing investors from funds contributed by new investors. Ponzi scheme organizers often solicit new investors by promising to invest funds in opportunities claimed to generate high returns with little or no risk. Now, to simplify a Ponzi scheme, it's where an organizer brings in investment funds from new investors, returns those funds to old investors in the form of dividends or returns on their investments, and so on and so forth. A collapse can occur when either there are no new investors or if too many of the investors withdraw all of their funds at the same time, causing cash flow issues for that scheme. Now, a notable Ponzi scheme is Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff may go down in history as the greatest scam artist and thief of all time. Over the life of his investment firm, which was an intricate Ponzi scheme, he cheated investors out of roughly $65 billion on paper and made off with approximately $20 billion. He was one of the founders of the NASDAQ and was an advisor to the SEC on securities trading, thus creating a trust within the financial market and no one would be suspected of him to create a Ponzi scheme. He was heavily involved in the financial industry for the past 30 years, and his scheme began to collapse when investors requested $7 billion in returns with only $200 to $300 million in available cash. Madoff's son soon learned of his father's actions and reported him to the SEC. 3 people involved in the Ponzi scheme, including Bernie Madoff's own son, committed suicide. The next notable case is Enron. Enron is perhaps the most famous scandal and white-collar crimes in the history of the United States. Enron, with the help of the auditors and accounting firm Arthur Andersen, inflated earnings and in an intricate set of schemes hid billions of dollars of debt in shell corporations. As the CEO began to dump his stock, he encouraged many of his employees to buy, thus driving up the value of the stock. The executives, through deregulation, were allowed to oversee the financial statements that were released to investors along with employees. Along with this, executives took compensation and bonuses based on their false earnings, which subsequently caused the company to go bankrupt. Investors lost upwards of $70 billion, and employees lost close to $2 billion. Accounting firm Arthur Andersen was complicit and aided in the scandal at Enron. These types of scandals are what lead the American people to distrust the financial industry and large companies. The effects on the investors were great. Many of them lost everything they had, along with their children's college savings account, their retirement accounts, homes, vehicles, and health insurance. As I've said before, some feel as though white-collar crimes are victimless crimes because you can't see a murder victim or a kidnapping victim or a rape victim, but time and again, this is disproven. As scandals surface, particularly in the last decade, it gives the appearance that these criminals can live out in the open and live extraordinary lives, all while ruining the lives of others. Once caught, many of these men and women, but not all, but many, receive light jail time and instead spend their time on probation or house arrest in their million-dollar mansions. Ethics, business, and white-collar criminals are all interconnected. In our society, unethical behavior has almost been an accepted practice, assuming that if a company reaches a certain size, they're going to have to cut some corners to get there. And once that they are that big, they're, and I quote, too big to fail. There is a persistent lack of trust between the general public and Wall Street. This was demonstrated in the housing crisis and in the financial collapse from late 2007 until early 2009. Many of our largest financial firms had been dealing with some shady deals and had allowed investors to invest in funds that they knew would eventually fail. One of the examples of a lack of respect from the executives comes about from Maurice Greenberg, an AIG executive, which was one of the companies affected by the 2008 financial crisis, brought suit against the U.S. government for taking control of 79.9% of its shares after the government, with taxpayer dollars, bailed out AIG. This again shows the lack of respect and trust that companies have towards the taxpayers and vice versa. There is government control and regulation, but I do not believe that there is enough. The Sherman Antitrust Act was the first major legislation to address oppressive business practices and oppressive monopolies. While this looked good on paper, the Sherman Antitrust Act did not give the federal government enough power to regulate these. The Clayton Act, which was passed in 1914, gave more power to the Federal Trade Commission along with the Department of Justice to enforce what the Sherman Antitrust Act outlawed. In present day, there have been sweeping reforms, but they have not done enough to curb the effects of white-collar crimes and shady financial dealings. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 was an act passed by U.S. Congress, which was intended to create oversight and rules and regulations and how companies such as Enron would report their finances to the public. Had they been forced to create financial documents and have their executives oversee those documents and put their names and signatures on them, they may have avoided collapse of Enron. Government control and regulation still is lacking, though time and time again we see the failures of Wall Street. There is slight punishment for abuse of investor funds, taxpayer bailouts, and the ineffective legislation that was passed post-2009 will allow companies to continue to do so. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Consumer Protection Act, which was passed in 2010, added further complexity to laws and regulations. This allows companies to find loopholes and to continue to do the dealings that they've been doing for decades to come. The finance industry and the American public has a large distrust, and I believe that is due to the lack of ethics. Had these companies treated their investors like their own, they would not have gone into these types of dealings. Until we have government regulation that can thoroughly and effectively oversee these financial institutions, I believe we will continue to see history repeat itself for decades to come. Thank you for watching and have a good afternoon.